What makes a good assessment? Assessment Design Approach. Welcome to the second of a series of video presentations which have been put together by Alpha Plus Consultancy with support from EEF and in partnership with the British Council and CBSE. These video presentations cover key aspects of a series of training courses which we have been delivering to teachers and CBSE staff to support end-of-class assessments that we have designed. These end-of-class assessments are for English reading, maths and science for classes 6 to 10. In this video, we will be looking at how assessments are designed and the key aspects which need to be taken into account. When designing an assessment, it is important that it is aligned to the teaching and learning and that it meets the purpose to which it is being put. The starting point is the subject itself and the purpose of the assessment. For the CBSE end-of-class assessments, content is defined by the CBSE syllabi, and the learning outcomes are set out in the NCERT curricula. The NCERT curricula also define the pedagogical approach, that is, how the subject should be taught. The assessment objectives are designed to allow the skills that students should demonstrate to be assessed so that they can show their competency in relation to the content and the learning outcomes. It is important that the assessment design is aligned to the teaching and learning approach because the teachers and students tend to focus on the assessments, particularly for high-stakes exams, and will teach and learn what is required to do well in the assessment. This is what allows them to progress. A challenge with the design of any assessment is that some skills and content are harder to assess than others, and therefore there can be misalignment where the assessment does not adequately reflect what should be taught. This can mean that teachers who are focused on meeting the assessment can pay too little attention to key aspects of the subject that are deemed important. This could apply to content or, more frequently, to skills such as analysis or practical skills, if the focus of the assessment is about showing knowledge and understanding of the subject. If the pedagogy and learning outcomes are misaligned with the assessment objectives and content, then it is more likely that the assessment will not meet the needs of the subject and it will distort the teaching and learning. This narrowing of the curriculum is a negative consequence of teaching to the test. However, if the assessment content and assessment objectives are well aligned to the learning outcomes and pedagogy, then this can have a positive impact and reinforces good teaching practice. This is known as the washback effect because the assessments encourage good teaching practice. The relationship between what is deemed important about a subject and the competency is one which needs to be understood when designing an assessment. There are a number of definitions of competency used in education and assessment. Different countries and types of assessment often have different definitions. For example, in the UK, competency is often used in vocational settings where it describes detailed statements of what a student is expected to master in order to be able to carry out a specific role or job. In this sense, it is a term not usually used in academic qualifications in the UK. However, in India, the NCERT curriculum uses a broader definition of competency to mean how well the student can demonstrate the defined learning outcomes in relation to content set by the boards. This shifts the focus away from the student just knowing the content set by the boards to the student being able to demonstrate that they can use the content set by the boards in different ways, such as applying knowledge to different settings, analyzing information, evaluating arguments, etc. It means that in order to define what needs to be assessed, the CBSE syllabus content has to be married to the NCERT curriculum. The design for the CBSE end-of-class assessments are based on the NCERT curriculum. This sets out the expected learning outcomes and the suggested pedagogical processes that teachers can use to meet these learning outcomes. An extract from the Class 9 Science is shown to illustrate this. The assessments are designed to be aligned with these within the limitations placed on them by practical considerations. In some cases, aspects of the NCERT curriculum are not readily accessible or cannot be assessed in a written assessment, such as reading aloud or creating scientific models using materials from surroundings. The content that is being taught is set out in the CBSE syllabi. These are high-level statements of what needs to be taught. This is supported by textbooks and other teaching resources which contain more details of the content set out in the syllabus. An extract from the Class 9 Science syllabus is shown to illustrate this. The end-of-class assessments were designed to assess this content in a way that would deliver valid and reliable results. The competencies that a student is expected to demonstrate need to be defined. They must be aligned to the learning outcomes and pedagogy and are a product of the content and the assessment objectives. For the CBSE end-of-class assessments, the content from the CBSE syllabi was matched to the NCERT curriculum to show how the learning outcomes of the curriculum linked to the defined content. This is set out in the learning ladder. An extract of the learning ladder for Science Class 9 is shown, which links the suggested pedagogy in column 1 and the learning outcomes in column 2 from the NCERT curriculum with the CBSE content, which is put into context in column 3. This learning ladder sets out the high-level domain which can be assessed. Suggestions about the assessment objectives and types of questions which link to the domain are also added in column 4, and we will look at assessment objectives now. The assessment objectives identify the high-level skills that will be assessed. They are less granular than learning outcomes and generally not linked directly to content or pedagogy. The assessment objectives are short, succinct statements which set out the skills that will be assessed. They are generally not related to the content, so each assessment objective can apply to multiple areas of content. However, some areas of content may lend themselves more readily to be assessed using a particular assessment objective than others are. Assessment objectives are key elements of the assessment design. They need to define the broad skills that should be assessed and hence guide those responsible for writing the items to the skills that the items must assess. Assessment objectives need to reflect what is important in the subject and ensure that the skills they describe will help meet the purpose of the assessments and address, in broad terms, the learning outcomes. Whilst they are independent of the content, they should be aligned so that the content and assessment objectives can be readily combined to create good quality items which assess what is important for the subject. Assessment objectives are often linked to the method of assessment, so that if a skill such as a performance of a practical task will have one or more specific assessment objectives which will be used to judge the performance of the student on the task. For example, in music, a student who performs a song may be assessed using assessment objectives related to technical competence, technical difficulty, interpretation, artistic flair, etc. Any constraints on an assessment about the method of assessment may have an impact on the assessment objectives. For example, in the CBSE end-of-class assessments, they are only written assessments, so there will be no assessment objectives related to the ability to carry out practical science tasks or to reading aloud in English. Assessment objectives can be generic and applied to assessments in different subjects, or, more usually, specific to a given subject. They are often based on Bloom's taxonomy or other similar classifications related to different levels of cognitive process. The use of a taxonomy such as Bloom's gives an indication of the likely level of demand that different assessment objectives would create for students. For example, an assessment objective based on remembering and understanding would create an easier assessment task than one which used an assessment objective based on analysis or evaluation if the content area was the same. When designing an assessment, it is not only important to accurately describe the assessment objectives, but to also identify their relative importance in the assessment by giving each one a weighting. This weighting will show the percentage of marks for each assessment objectives. It will, in part, depend upon the content to be covered and the relative importance of the skills, but it also depends on the wider context in which the assessment operates. This would include education policy and political position, which may dictate the esteem in which different skills are held. This is a somewhat subjective decision. Other contextual considerations would include whether there was a change in emphasis when new assessments are introduced. For example, if there was an increased emphasis in teaching and learning higher-order skills, then this may suggest that the weightings of the assessment objectives would evolve over time to reflect this emphasis and the fact that the teaching and learning will not change immediately. This means that the weighting may be expressed as a small range to allow change over time. Assessment objective weightings can also be expressed as a range to allow a small degree of flexibility in the creation of assessments, though they can also be expressed as a fixed value. It is important that any range is not too large, as this could cause the demand of the assessments to change from assessment to assessment as the proportion of harder and easier assessment objectives change. When designing an assessment, the weighing of the assessment objectives should be a minimum of 10%. Otherwise, it risks trivializing the assessment, and the impact an individual assessment objective would have on the final performance would not be significant enough. The assessment objectives which have been written for the CBSE end-of-class assessments are subject-specific and have been created in line with best international practice, but also reflect the Indian context as expressed by the requirements in the NCERT curriculum. The first two assessment objectives for English reading require students to show understanding of a text. The third one requires the student to analyze how the writer creates different effects and is used in reviewing literature texts for classes 9 and 10 only. Assessment Objective 4 requires students to provide a personal evaluation of a text. Additional assessment objectives will be required to assess writing, listening, and speaking skills. For maths, there are just two assessment objectives. The first requires students to show understanding of math skills, and the second requires students to apply understanding of math skills to solve problems in different contexts. Analysis of numeric information is so integral to all mathematical tasks that it is not called out as a separate skill, but subsumed within these two assessment objectives. There are 4 assessment objectives for science which are aligned to Bloom's taxonomy. The first requires the demonstration of knowledge and understanding, and the second the application of this knowledge and understanding to different scenarios. Assessment Objective 3 relates to analysis of scientific information to present and interpret data, and the last assessment objective requires students to evaluate scientific information to draw conclusions and develop experimental procedure. This last assessment objective covers 2 different aspects of the evaluation skill in 2 different contexts, but they are not given separate weightings as they are based on the same overall skill. Once the teaching and high-level assessment requirements have been identified, the output should be an assessment domain which sets out the assessment content. The assessment objectives and a broad set of rules for how the assessment will work, such as the type or types of assessment that will be used, will also be produced. This can then be used to design the detailed assessment specification, which sets out the details of how the assessments are constructed. Assessment design principles are the rules and limitations put in place related to how the assessment will work. Some emerge naturally from the analysis of the learning outcomes and pedagogy, and others from the content, but many will be defined for other reasons. These may be because of face validity issues. For example, there should be a maximum proportion of multiple choice questions because they are perceived to be easier, or they may be due to practical constraints such as limiting the assessment to a particular form, for example, written assessment and not computer-based or practical activity. For the CBSE end-of-class assessments, the main design principles were: it would be written format only, as this was most practical for teachers to deliver in the classroom, but teachers would be expected to assess students themselves on other skills, such as those required to carry out science practical tasks, which cannot be assessed in a written assessment. For English, only the reading skill will be assessed, so writing, speaking, and listening will need to be assessed by teachers in classroom and other activities. The assessments would be marked by the teachers so they could see how their class were performing. The assessments must be based on the NCERT curriculum areas in order to encourage the move to competency-based learning. The assessment must assess higher-order skills so that there is a positive washback effect on the teaching and learning of these skills. The length of the assessment must be easy for schools to deliver and be appropriate for the age of the students so that they are manageable. For science, calculators will be allowed, and for maths, calculators will be allowed, but there must also be some assessment of mental math skills. Assessments can rarely cover all of the content that is defined in a syllabus, so this content must be sampled. Sufficient content must be sampled to allow the students to show what they can do across a range of topics and skills. When sampling, the assessment needs to focus on what is important and sample proportionately across areas of content related to their importance, whilst ensuring a broad coverage across different areas of the domain. The sampling needs to be broad enough to cover sufficient content, but not so broad that the assessment becomes too long and unmanageable for schools or students. The sampling approach also needs to ensure that the assessment is coherent. That is, it holds together as a series of tasks that flow, and the student is not faced with a random scattergun series of questions which would be off-putting. In high-stakes exams, it is important that the domain is sampled appropriately over time to ensure all aspects are assessed in a way which is not overly predictable. If this is not the case, then the teachers and students may narrow the teaching and learning, as they will expect certain content areas not to appear in the exam they are taking. This sampling of the domain lies at the heart of the design of an assessment, as it governs the number of questions to be asked and hence the number of marks and the length of the assessment. The features of the assessment design need to be captured in an assessment specification. This is a document which sets out the overall approach for all of the assessments for a subject. It will include the assessment objectives and their weightings to ensure consistent assessment of the skills, the type of assessments which will be used, which will also depend on the assessment objectives and the design principles, the way that the domain is divided and how much of the assessment will be dedicated to each of the areas defined. How many assessments will be needed will depend on the sampling and the maximum length of assessment possible, as well as other constraints such as the use of calculators in some maths assessments. The types of questions used will depend on the skills being assessed. Will there be multiple choice or other objective questions? Will there be short answer questions or longer extended prose questions? The number of questions will depend on the sampling and the types of question. There are generally more shorter answer questions in an assessment than there would be extended response questions, as one extended response question would normally allow a wider range of content to be covered than one short answer question. The number of marks will be a product of the number and type of questions used, though it is often rounded to a figure that is sensible for the assessment. Assessments can be structured into sections based on content. For example, English with different reading sources having different sections, or different assessment types such as a section of multiple choice questions and then short answer and a section with extended response at the end. Structure helps make the assessment more predictable and familiar to students, but it risks constraining the assessment and making it harder to link different topic areas or skills. The length of the assessment will depend on the number and type of questions. Assessments should not be too time-bound. The time should be long enough to allow most students to answer all the questions. They should not be a test of how fast you can read and write, unless that is an explicit purpose of the assessment. There are often rules of thumb provided for the relationship between the length of an assessment and the number of marks it contains, though this varies between countries and subjects. The assessment specifications for the CBSE end-of-class assessments have been written to allow assessment creators, including teachers, to use the learning ladder, which contains the NCERT curriculum and CBSE content to create their own assessments. They set out the key features of the assessments and show how content is sampled and the numbers and types of questions, as well as the numbers of marks and the assessment length. The assessments can then be created using items which are in the item bank, or by the assessment creator writing their own items to be included in the assessment. In the next video, we will look at the approach to writing items.